me and the need to feed people before they participate in this panel. It's great that you're here. My name's Nick Blomley, and I'm, I guess, moderating this panel. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. I'm going to introduce our panelists and explain what we're going to be doing in a minute. But before we do that, I've had a request for a very short public announcement. So can I just turn over to over here?
Hi, we are part of the Place and Space Collective, and we are currently raising money for Venezuelan migrants due to the political upheaval happening in the country. There's food and medical shortages. A lot of the migrants are going into neighboring countries, including Colombia, and there is a center here which is helping migrants regardless of their legal status, providing shelter, food, and legal advice. We're going to be here for a talk afterwards. If you want to donate, please come see us, and if you have any questions about the center or about the collective itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Much appreciated. Okay. So our presentation is called "Commenting in the City: A Conversation with Amanda Huron." So here is Amanda. Amanda is Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Social Sciences at the University of the District of Columbia, which is a public university serving Washington, D.C. and her research interests include geography, housing, the decommodification of land, and the history of Washington, D.C. And she serves on the board of Empower D.C., which works to counter displacement in the city, and was born and raised in D.C. and has just written a book. And she has copies of her book, which you can also buy, as well as participating in the historical initiative over here. So what we're doing here is the purpose is to have Amanda speak for a little bit on her book, which is called Carving Out the Commons, Tenant Organizing and Housing Cooperatives in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure she's going to explain about that project for you for maybe half an hour. And what's really exciting, well, the book itself seems exciting in and of itself, but it's also exciting to me because of this theme of commoning, thinking about the commons and the ways in which commoning can be actually enacted on the ground in cities, DC, and perhaps also in, well, not perhaps, but actually in places like Vancouver. So what's going to happen after the presentation is that we're going to have our three panelists respond to the presentation. And maybe I'll introduce our panelists in more detail when we get to it, but they are Antonia Ogundele, no, not even close.
Antonia Ogundele.
Ogundele, okay. Lama Bogabo and Matt Huron. So I'll introduce those guys in more detail in a minute, but Amanda, thanks so much for being here. It's wonderful you're here. We also have to thank the Department of Geography and Urban Studies for helping to facilitate this meeting. Awesome. So it's all yours. Thanks very much.
Make sure that's what you're hearing.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Nick, for making this happen. I'm really excited to be here with the panelists. So I am going to start with just reading a couple pages from the very beginning of the book, just to give you a sense of kind of a story that helps set up what we're going to be talking about. It's Christmas Eve, 1977, and the mail carrier is making his rounds through a working-class apartment complex in Washington, D.C. He can't help but notice after a while that he's delivering the exact same letter to every tenant, and he becomes curious, even concerned about the letter's contents. Soon he runs into Sherry, a single mother living with her twin 8-month-old babies in a one-bedroom apartment in the complex. He asks Sherry what's inside the envelope. As Sherry recounts years later, "So I said, well, I'll open one. And I did, and I started crying. And he read it, and he started crying, because he had to deliver them all." The letters were eviction notices. The tenants were being informed that they had to be out of their homes in 90 days. Their entire 8-building complex, home to nearly 100 people, was being evicted to make way for a developer who planned to raise the modest 3-story structures and build tall luxury apartments in their stead. Sherry was shocked. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to stay in the neighborhood called Glover Park, which was relatively safe and convenient. She'd left her old neighborhood after her apartment had been broken into one too many times. Desperate, she tacked flyers to the trees on her block, offering a $50 reward to anyone who could help her find an affordable apartment nearby. The problem facing Sherry and her fellow tenants was part of a larger trend. In the mid-1970s, Washington, D.C. and a handful of other U.S. cities, perhaps Canadian cities as well, were hit with a newly recognized phenomenon, gentrification. Middle-class residents and investment dollars were returning to certain centrally located historic neighborhoods in cities like D.C., San Francisco, and Boston. With gentrification came the displacement of lower-income residents who could no longer afford the rising rents, or who were being evicted wholesale to make room for new development. In the mid-1970s, stories of displacement in D.C. filled the news. The New York Times told the story of a developer who bought up a string of 13 row houses on a single block in Washington's Adams Morgan neighborhood, evicting all 26 black families who lived there. In 1978, the Washington Post reported evictions in the city jumped nearly 5 times over the previous year. Eviction was everywhere, and people were scared. But, unbeknownst to Sherry, her neighbors had already started organizing. Ruth was another young woman who lived in the complex. When she received the eviction notice, she recalls feeling devastated. At first, she said, "I didn't know what to do. But then I talked to somebody who suggested I try to organize a meeting. So I did in my apartment, and a lot of people came. And while we were in the meeting, there was a knock on the door, and it was a server who was hand-delivering the same eviction notice. But this time, we were all together." She pauses. "It was very interesting. That was the moment where we began to intuit that we were going to have to do this together." For nearly 2 years, the tenants worked together, first to stop the evictions and then to buy the apartment complex collectively themselves. In buying the complex, they had few models to imitate, and were mostly making it up as they went along. They knew they wanted control over their own homes, and they wanted to remain in place. But they were disturbed by the thought of owning the buildings as condominiums, the very ownership form they saw devouring low-income homes all over the city. So when they finally purchased the buildings in 1979, they decided to use the limited equity cooperative ownership structure. Under the limited equity co-op model, members paid low amounts for a co-op share and paid low monthly co-op fees. If they ever moved out, they could sell their share for the same amount for which they bought it, plus a small amount of interest, in order to keep the unit affordable for the next low or moderate income person. In addition, they set aside about 20% of their units for people using federal housing vouchers to pay their co-op fees. "We incorporated," Sherry said later, "to preserve affordable housing in Glover Park. That was kind of our mission. Other than our co-op, I don't know of any affordable housing in Glover Park, and maybe not even in our part of the city." But just as important as affordability, Ruth emphasizes, was the fact that co-op members had control over their space and could collectively determine how to run it. What these tenants were doing in late 1970s Washington was creating a commons. They were taking a resource, housing, that had been used to extract profit for their landlord, and they were reshaping it to a resource that was collectively owned and controlled by the people who lived in it. The purpose of the apartment complex was no longer to serve as an investment vehicle for its owner, but rather to house people who needed an affordable, stable place to live. And the tenants were doing this in a capitalist city beset with struggles over land and housing, a place filled with strangers, where tenants often did not know one another well and had little prior basis for collective action. They were practicing the urban commons. So what I'm doing in this book is thinking about what it means to practice the urban commons. So what is this urban commons of which I speak? I understand the commons as a resource that's marked really by 2 key traits. It's been decommodified, at least partially, mostly, and 2, it's collectively governed, and perhaps also collectively owned, but certainly collectively governed. Its value is in how it's used directly by people to support life rather than its exchange value in the market. And it's also not just like a static resource, it's really a social act. The commons are created and maintained by people working together over time. So it might be better to speak of commoning as a verb rather than sort of the commons as a noun, to emphasize that taking care of these resources and claiming them is really a process. Now, commons have been studied all over the world, and there's a huge literature on looking at commons management schemes. And until recently, most of that work has looked at the sort of what is called the developing world, looking at natural resources. And I was curious to see, as I started talking to people and thinking about this idea of the commons, I was wondering, okay, how does this work in a city? And what are maybe the challenges to commoning in a city? And is it possible to create an urban commons? So I think about the urban commons as having really 3 distinct qualities. First, it's made up of people who may be strangers to each other. So the city is made up in large part by strangers. You don't have a personal relationship with everyone you come into contact with in the city. So on the one hand, it might be harder to common with people. On the other hand, people are coming from different places. If they're able to figure out how to work together, that could actually be tremendously powerful to common in cities with that sort of diversity and that difference. So lots of different people working together. Cities also came into existence really as a way to store wealth and capital. And we often, not always, but we often see higher land and real estate pressures in cities, and therefore more pressure on people without access to wealth and capital. So it might be harder to maintain these decommodified resources in the midst of that kind of intense pressure. So this is a real challenge potentially to creating and maintaining commons in the city, is that pressure. And then also cities may also be more closely regulated by the state than other places. Some historians argue that permanent settlements came about in part because it enabled those in power to more effectively control people once you're in place. So trying to seize and maintain commons in the city forces us to deal with the relationship between the commons and the state, which I think is a really interesting thing to look at. I think often the state is seen as antagonistic to people's efforts to claim and maintain a commons, but I think we can also look at how the state might actually help support a commons. So we'll talk some about that. Okay, so to some images here. This is a limited equity housing cooperative in Washington, D.C., a grand opening that took place in the Brightwood neighborhood. Is anyone familiar with D.C.'s geography at all? So this is a historically working class, middle class, African-American neighborhood in D.C. So I understand limited equity housing cooperatives as a form of the urban commons. Housing co-ops, I'm sure you all know, and I know there's lots of different kinds of housing co-ops here in Vancouver, so probably saying something you already know. But in a housing cooperative, members own a share in the building, have the right to occupy a particular unit. In a limited equity co-op, members buy in, that share price is quite low. And then your monthly co-op fee, or called carrying charges sometimes, is also quite low. And then if you ever sell your share, you're limited in the amount you can sell it for to keep it affordable to the next buyer. And so it's a way of creating a form of home ownership that's affordable to multiple generations of members. And so I conceive of these limited equity co-ops as a form of the commons because they're essentially non-commodified, although not totally, not at all. I mean, you still have to pay money to live in them. But they've been removed from the speculative market, and they're collectively owned and governed. So Washington, D.C. has a relatively large number of these co-ops, not compared, I should note, to Vancouver, but compared to other U.S. cities. And it's not a huge amount, but a conservative estimate is about between 3,100 and 3,200 units of housing that are as part of these limited equity co-ops all over the city. So it represents affordable, stable housing for thousands of Washingtonians. And one of the questions I had in my research, and a question I think is important to look at, is how did these commons emerge? And I think it's important to look historically at that, at how commons have emerged in particular places, because we need to learn how we could do that now here too. And commons are always, you have to seize them. They don't just kind of happen. So how did this happen in this city in this time? So really, my understanding, my sort of theory about this is that the reason we have a whole bunch of decommodified, collectively governed housing in the city, a relatively large amount, is because of the sort of collision of two forces in the mid-1970s in DC. And one was that we finally got home rule, meaning we got the right to elect our own mayor and city council in the city in 1974. And Washington, D.C. did not have the right to elect its own mayor and city council for 100 years. So in the, when the city was founded in 1800, there were elected officials, only, of course, white men who owned property could vote at first. In 1867, black men were given the right to vote in the city, in local elections in the city. And the city had a rapidly increasing black population during the Civil War and right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, because the city was the closest city to the South, and was the first place many people who were escaping slavery or who had left immediately after emancipation were DC was the first place they hit. And so a lot of African Americans came to DC. Of course, it was also the headquarters of the Union Army during the Civil War, so it was seen as a relatively safe place compared to the rest of the South. We are in the South, but we were, and we were a slaveholding city from the beginning. But during the Civil War, it was seen as a safer place for African Americans coming from the South. And so when black men got the right to vote in 1867 and started to flex their political muscle, the white city fathers, business class, said, this is a little bit terrifying to us, and we would rather actually give up the right to vote for everyone in the city than risk increasing black political power in the city. And so In 1874, so sort of like as Reconstruction was sort of waning, that right to vote in the city was revoked. And so it was not until 100 years later, 1974, that we finally got the right to vote back. DC was the first city in the US to become majority African American. That was in 1957, the first major city. And it had long been actually a mecca for African Americans throughout the country. And so getting the right to vote back in the 70s was seen as this like really incredible, important civil rights struggle, and finally it was won through some very creative organizing, actually. So we finally get the right to vote in 1974, and this is one of the first city councils that was elected. And most of the people who were elected to the city council in the 70s, well, they are most of them had been seasoned in the civil rights movement, and most of them had come out of the more left wing of the civil rights movement. They were part of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee and were very heavily involved in civil rights activism. And at this time, they were really turning their attention to issues of economic justice. And so there was just an incredible creativity and kind of really thinking through, like, well, how do we create economic justice for people? And so that was going on in the 1970s. So we finally have this majority black city finally gets the right to elect its own leadership after 100 years. So that's going on, but at the same time, we also in this very same time, in the 1970s, are seeing this, this gentrification that's hitting the city. And this is a Washington Post article from 1979. And as you can see in the upper right here, low-income blacks pushed into PG, and PG stands for Prince George's County, which is a county right to the southeast of the city. And then the jump to this page, high housing costs push low-income blacks into PG, Washington turning into a city for only the rich. When I show this article to people in Washington, D.C., they're like, oh my God, this really could be from like today's newspaper. You know, it's this language and the way people are talking about, like, oh my God, we're turning into a city for only the rich. But this was in 1979. And so this was going on in the mid and late 70s in the city, this massive displacement of people, massive eviction, and real fear that just as we're gaining this political power, people are going to be gone from the city. It's, you know. So, as a result of this very progressive city council and fears about displacement and a lot of tenant organizing, so there's a lot of, this is another article from '79 about just talking about tenant organizing, fighting displacement in the city. This is another image about some tenant organizing efforts in the late 1970s. The Southern Columbia Heights Tenants Union, a neighborhood-based group. So tenants were organizing pretty strongly and putting pressure on the city council. And the result being that as soon as they took office in '75, this newly elected government, they immediately turned their attention to anti-displacement legislation. And they passed all sorts of really creative stuff. And all sorts of things. They passed, they passed a rent control policy. They passed an anti-speculation tax, which was an effort to prevent the flipping of homes, which was an interesting idea that ultimately, if you've sold your home within a certain period of time, a short period of time, and for X number of dollars over what you originally bought it for, you could be subject to a tax as high as 90%. So it was basically an attempt to just remove profit from flipping. Now it failed as a policy. It was, I think, only collected once or twice. It was, it's one thing to have a law, it's another thing to actually enforce the law. And so it was, but it was indicative, I think, of the creativity that people had thinking about this stuff. There were moratoria on converting rental buildings to condominium. There'd be like a 6-month moratorium. Like, nobody can do this. Stop. We need to put the brakes on this and figure out what's happening. Like, what can we do? And then one of the really creative pieces of legislation that was passed was something called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And it was passed in its original form in '77 and then kind of finalized more or less in 1980. This gives tenants the first right to purchase their building if their landlord puts it up for sale. So a tenant of a single-family home, of a multifamily building, any tenant, anywhere in the city has that right. And so many tenants associations have exercised TOPA, it's called Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, have exercised these TOPA rights to buy their buildings. Now, the way it's worked for low-income tenants associations, they still have to pay the market price for the building. So, the landlord's doing fine. They're getting their price. But the city, in addition to creating the law, also created financing to help low-income tenants associations purchase the buildings, typically in the form of zero-interest loans. And those loans would be combined with other loans, and these very complicated, kind of complex financing arrangements that were required to make this happen. But so this is how tenants associations have been able to purchase these buildings, and they're all over the city in every section. Well, not so much in Glover Park, the one we heard about in the book, but they're throughout the city. So just a few examples of some of these, and these are some Washington Post articles again from the late 70s and early 80s. It's a protest outside a building that was set to be sold. Tenants and neighbors sat in the grass sipping beer and munching snacks as rock bands played and a mime entertained the children. Esther Siegel, this tenant leader here, who's speaking in front of these banners, said the block party had a more serious purpose. It was, she said, a show of solidarity with other tenants across the city who face evictions as their projects are withdrawn from the rental market for various reasons, typically for costly remodeling or conversion to condominiums. This is one of the first co-ops created. Here's another very early one. Finding that inhabitable rental apartments were too expensive and cheaper housing unfit to live in, a group of low-income Southeast, and Southeast is east of the Anacostia River, historically very cut off economically from the rest of the city. A group of low-income Southeast apartment dwellers have found a way to obtain a decent home, a low-equity cooperative. More than 50 families living in the Jeffrey Terrace apartments received title this week to the 3 decaying buildings at Stanton and Elgins Road Southeast. The tenants will renovate the 67 units and rename the complex the People's Cooperative, said Barbara Valentine, pictured here, president of the Tenants Association. People's Cooperative is still the People's Cooperative. 40 years later, one of my students has just written a really wonderful article about the whole history of the People's Cooperative. Very interesting history. And a third one here, this is Daisy Fernandez. Soon after Daisy Fernandez moved into the Pasadena apartments in Adams Morgan in 1978, the ceiling caved in. Things got worse. Rats and roaches multiplied. Plumbing broke down. For 2 winters, there was no heat. It's very typical of these conditions, these buildings. She organized the tenants, many of them poor Hispanics like herself, into a residents group. Then, as president of the Residents Association, she helped lead the effort to buy the building and find the $2.2 million in financing needed to buy the building and fix it. Now the 4-story Pasadena in the 2600 block of Adams Mill Road Northwest has new ceilings, plumbing that works, and kitchens with new appliances. So I think this history is important to know how these buildings have been seized by their tenants, taken over, and sort of how they've gained control. And it's also interesting that many of the people who I interviewed who were doing this work were women. And so there's interesting dynamics going on there. So why is this commons important? I mean, why is this, what does it provide its members? I conducted 40 in-depth interviews with members of limited equity co-ops around the city. I focused on 10 co-ops and I tried to get a range of diversity across the city in terms of age of co-op, demographics of membership, where they were located in the city, the size of the co-op. And in terms of what it provides its members, the most important things I found, which will probably not surprise you, were affordability, was the most important one, control, stability, and community. So an example of affordability, this is a picture of the Adams Morgan neighborhood in the 1980s. In the foreground here, we see an apartment building that's being renovated to be turned into a luxury condominium. And in the background, we see this red brick building with the plywood over one window. That was a rental apartment building where the tenants wanted to turn it into a limited equity cooperative. And so this was a neighborhood that was experiencing intense gentrification. And these tenants knew that if they could hang on to this building they've been renting, if they could convert themselves into owners, they hoped that they would be able to stay in the neighborhood. So when I was doing this research, what I found is that the monthly fees of these limited equity co-ops today, or at the time of my research, so 2012 or so, was about half the housing and Department of Housing and Urban Development fair market rents. So what they sort of, that calculation. So it's about half of the rents in the city. And a Washington Post article from 1986 about this particular co-op stated, the community is on the cutting edge of a gentrification process that's displacing some of its low-income housing stock with upscale condominiums. The neighborhood's gentrification is, quote, hindering us because the landlord feels like he can make a killing at our expense, said Rashida Ahmad, president of the building's tenants group called The Last Holdouts. there's some really well-named tenants associations. It's really fun to see some of these, the names of some of these groups. And so this is an image of the grand opening of the last Holdouts Tenants Association once they were able to purchase their buildings, get them renovated, and they named it the Champlain Court Co-op because they're on Champlain Street. And this in the center here is Marion Barry, who was mayor for many years in DC, was mayor this time. And when you look at old photographs of co-op openings, he's often there. And one of our other mayors are often there. And I think, you know, it's, there was a lot of support for this kind of cooperative housing in the city at the time. And it was really seen as a way for low-income, mostly black people to get an ownership stake in the city. And that's something he very much wanted to support. Okay, so affordability is really critical. Also control over the spaces. These are a couple photographs that document conditions in some of these buildings before renovations took place. And so these are, I think, a bit extreme, these examples, but point being that conditions were often very bad in these buildings by the time the tenants actually were able to buy the buildings. And often landlords have been disinvesting in these properties for years and years before they finally sold it. And so, here's another grand opening celebration. This is a co-op in the Shaw neighborhood, which is right near downtown. And the tenants in this building for years have been fighting the landlord about housing code violations and never really getting much done. But we're able to get control over that housing and really renovate it in a way that worked for them. Also, social control was really important to people I talked to. You know, as renters, they had no say over who they lived with. And this often was difficult, especially in buildings where front door locks were broken, people were just coming and going. There was a horrific crack epidemic in the city in the 80s, and a lot of violence in the 80s and 90s. And so people really wanted to have some control over who could come in and out, which I think speaks to some interesting questions about exclusion and inclusion in the commons and how we talk about that. So social control is really important too. So the third important factor was stability. This is another group standing on their front steps of their building. And I think particularly for children, stability is understood to be really important. Just not fearing eviction, not fearing the building being sold out from under you. And then finally, the community that these co-ops generated was important for people. This building is particularly interesting because it's a relatively small building, but they had tenants from Ethiopia. DC is a big Ethiopian immigrant population, and Central America and African Americans. And so every tenant meeting they had in the lead up to purchasing the building was translated into, you know, was in all 3 languages. Like, they're very committed to that. And they really were able to, I mean, to hear some of these folks talk about the experience, it sounds like they were really able to build this really strong community in this building. So that's all great. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to these housing co-ops. I think there's benefits broadly to life in the commons. But there's also a lot of work involved. And this is something I kept coming back to, was all the work of the commons. This is a newsletter. WISH is Washington Inner City Self-Help, which was an organization that helped a lot of co-ops start. So this is a newsletter from '93. And this is, you know, the victories are pretty well documented. You know, you see lots of celebrations. This was the Mandela Cooperative, so named for Nelson Mandela, who had relatively recently been released from prison. The Harriet Tubman Co-op, there's a Malcolm X Co-op, there's a God is in Control Co-op. You know, there's lots of different ways that people express their, like, you know, sentiments about things. And so, but what people don't tend to document in their photographs is just the work that's involved. So I don't actually have very many good images of people sitting around in meetings, which is what a lot of the work is. Or people, like, these days, people sitting at the computer sending emails, knocking on doors, you know, all that stuff. We don't take pictures of ourselves doing those things. So, so there's a number of challenges to keep the urban commons going. There's financial challenges, like I mentioned. I mean, the landlords have sucked all the capital out of the resource by the time they sell it to the tenants. And so you're often really having to catch up. I mean, sometimes landlords leave behind unpaid utility bills. There's all sorts of stuff. So the capital's really been sucked out. So there's can be really intense financial challenges. There's also these questions of access and exclusion, like who gets to move into this space? How do you determine that? I mean, you know, I'd like to think that scarcity doesn't, you know, I mean, like I'd like to get beyond thinking of everything in terms of scarcity, but there is a real issue about, okay, this is a material amount of housing with a certain amount of it, with a huge amount of need, like how do people access it? does the commons itself become a scarce commodity in this case? And then there's challenge of what people over and over again call participation. I would ask them, what are your challenges? Well, participation. It's like, after a time, it seems like participation is just another way to say work. And I was like, well, let's just talk about how it's labor, it's work, what people are doing. It's unwaged, but it's a lot of work involved here. And it's mostly being done by women. And then there's all sorts of challenges of, having the time to do that work. I think, a lot of people who I spoke to, I had spoke to a woman who's a pharmacy technician earning, $14 an hour, lived way on the other side of town from where she worked, got up at 4 o'clock every morning to take the metro across town to work, was married with 5 children, and she did participate in a co-op board for a term, and she's like, it was a great experience, I think everyone should participate at least once on the co-op boards, they know what it's all about. She's like, I couldn't keep participating. And it's like, yeah, it's very hard when you're living under this high-pressured capitalist in this context to actually participate and to do that work of the commons. So there's some real contradictions there that I think are we have to deal with and figure out. And then another big challenge is the temptation of co-optation. So I see with all these housing prices going up around us, can we figure out a way to turn our limited equity co-op into a market rate condo? Is that, and then we can, have a huge amount of cash, and that the housing goes away as affordable housing, but cash is gained. So that's a really, and that's, that's a real, that could be something people really want, understandably. And there's some very interesting stories of how that's happened and not happened in DC. Of the 10 co-ops I looked at, 3 had gone market rate at a certain point. So 3 were former limited equity co-ops. I was interested in seeing how did that happen? What was the result for people who had been living there? So that was interesting. And I think I should also note, as I wrap it up, that one of the reasons I was interested in thinking about the commons was because I was sort of intrigued by this concept of the commons. I've been sort of reading about it, but I felt like it was a very romantic concept. It was just sort of often just, oh, let's just seize the commons, and everything's gonna be good. And I was like, God, I'm into this idea of people collectively governing these resources that have been removed from the market. They're sort of for the use of, for life, for human life, not for exchange. But there's a lot of difficulties in doing that. And I want to look at that realistically. And be prepared to be really disappointed, by what actually happens. So there's definitely some failure documented in this book for sure. And then I end the book, so I'll just go to the last slide, thinking about practicing commenting, and thinking about how we, in some ways, we all comment all the time. And it's just totally, I was talking to the editor of the book, we were trying to figure out the title, and I was like, maybe we should just call it The Banality of the Commons. And he was like, I don't know. Which isn't quite my point, but it's kind of, it's we just do this all the time. So in a way, it's totally natural. But in another way, if you were raised in a more or less capitalist society, it can be quite difficult to learn how to do this, how to work together in these contexts. So I do think the idea of practicing the urban commons is really important, both in the sense of practicing it, doing something right now, but also in the sense of practicing for a future thing that we're not sure what it is yet. But and so I think we need to practice at the scales that are available to us now, maybe working within the context of your housing co-op or any number of other forms of urban commons, of which there's many. I focus on housing co-ops, but there's many forms it can take. And I also think it's important to remember that for now, the commons are always contingent. They're always under threat. So how do we practice them and learn as we go? And I do think if we're going to seize more of them and keep them and expand them and work together, we need to figure out together how we're going to do that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Why don't we move on over to the new furniture over here? Let's do that. So now we're in the chair. So thanks, Amanda. That was great, very stimulating, good start to our conversation. So we have a whole bunch of commoners in this room. It's great. I mean, commoners used to be like an insult, right? I'll tell you where I come from. Yes. It was not a good thing, but we're so commoners are great, and we have some lovely commoners as well as Amanda to continue the conversation. So I'll just quickly introduce. Anthony Ogundele leads the Environmental Sustainability and Emergency Management Program at Van City Credit Union. She's a trained planner with a passion for cities and emerging communities. While at the University of Waterloo, her research focused on the social sustainability of redevelopment projects in Nairobi, Kenya. And she currently sits on the Northeast Falls Creek Stewardship Committee and on the Hogan's Alley Working Group, exploring opportunities for community land stewardship as a means of honouring the history of Hogan's Alley and disrupting the legacy of displacement by the city of Vancouver. And with her husband, she coordinates an art space on Carroll Street called the Cheeky Proletariat. And she's also the humble star player of her recreational women's basketball team. Oops, I did it again.
Yeah.
Great name. So Matt over here, Matt Huron is another fine commoner, a founder of Solid State Industries, teaches at multiple universities and lectures widely, and he's the author of many books, including his new one, which will be released later this month, March 28th.
Yep, true.
There's a big thing outside in the lobby. You can see them like flashing up on the screen, which is co-authored with Andrew Hull and Joe Sacco. It's called Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, a Tar Sands Tale. And Lama Magabo is a community organizer at CAP, Carnegie Community Action Project, and an active member of Our Homes Can't Wait, which is a community-based organization that advocates for housing, social justice, and poverty alleviation in Vancouver's downtown east side. And in 2016, Lama founded the Carnegie African Descent Group as a platform for advocacy and social transformation. And since last year, Lama has also served on Hogan's Alley Working Group, an initiative set up to promote the revitalisation of Hogan's Alley, a black community that was destroyed by Vancouver's urban renewal policy in 1972. So great to have you all here. Thanks very much. We didn't decide who was going to go first. So does anyone want to? Who's going to go first?
I can go first.
Okay, well, that's great. So you're welcome to sit here, or you're welcome to stand there, or walk around. Or
Oh my goodness.
But we can go for like 5-10 minutes. That's fantastic. And then we're going to open it up to.
I have some notes here, but I'll kind of myself. Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing that with us, and thank you all for coming out and joining us for this dialogue. And I'm really happy that I have this opportunity to share my thoughts. I think we've all had an opportunity to read the first chapter of her book, or the introduction at least. So some of my comments are going to be just based on that, but also trying to pull in some of the things that I heard while you were speaking. But I think all of my reflections still kind of stay there. I think that after reading the introduction of the book, it really offered a thought-provoking reflection of how to understand the commons in our urban environments. And in this time of skyrocketing home prices and deep, ever-expanding inequality, this is an important conversation that we can no longer look to our individual means to subsist and start to consider how we live in this city together. And so I would say, despite, again, the high prices, it's actually a really ripe time for us to start looking to each other and looking at collective action. So I'll offer my feedback more in the form of a reflection of how I became engaged in Hogan's Alley work, which was deeply aligned with the interrogation of the commons. So I recall having conversations with members of the Black community to talk about how we can heal together and how we can build together. And again, in the Vancouver market, it's quite daunting to think about how do you begin to see yourself in this space and building some sort of community or even opportunities on your own. So we started to think about collective ownership models, democratizing land ownership and respond to the needs of the present community, but also how do you ensure this for a future? So the history of displacement in Hogan's Alley is not uncommon to other North American cities. This has happened, as we've talked to other people across the state. It's happened in Chicago, it's happened in Detroit, it's happened in quite a few places, and even very seldomly spoken of in the Canadian context that we can talk about after you go. But what makes this particular timing important is the opportunity to not only honor the history of those that were in the past, but to begin to rebuild a future that addresses the inequality that was reinforced by private land ownership and entrenched in multi-generational wealth. As a woman of color, particularly as a Black woman, there are two things I noticed when I moved to Vancouver. I moved here from Toronto. There's a stark visible urban inequality that manifests itself as socially segregated areas across the city. The other thing you notice is that when there are conversations starting to address these alternative forms of ownership, it's quite homogeneous, both racially and economically. And dare I step into Marxist language and say that it's usually the intelligentsia that are in the room talking about these common conversations. So while these models endeavor to move away from the capitalist economic and financial aspect, its success depends deeply on social capital of individuals that are engaged, and it could either be in the form of social capital from the outside, so kind of just knowing someone who can give you a lead on a place or places to invest, or it could be internally, just having the privilege to, maybe have lived in one of those homes for an extended period of time and have built a close-knit community. So the question I have is this the commons? I'm going to share a very quick story. Lama and I had the amazing opportunity to go to Oakland this past fall to the Community Land Trust Conference, and it was phenomenal, and mind-blowing is just an understatement on the amazing work that's happening in the U.S. But while I was there, I had the opportunity to tour a number of different land trusts that were in the area and ask questions. What I found out were a couple of things, and I think you brought it up as you were speaking, around accessibility remains a challenge into becoming aware or networked into communities, exploring this work, and affordable home ownership remained a prevalent, and the second thing was affordable home ownership remained a prevalent approach in utilizing the community land trust model, which with the Canadian consortium, we were actually moving away from having the limited equity co-ops being kind of the majority of it, to just providing rental housing. The other thing that was deeply insightful was from a former Black Panther who also showed us around housing co-ops named after civil rights leaders, which is again very interesting that is kind of how it is there. I asked this deeply engaged individual the question, given the Black Panthers' affinity towards collective actions, like they were deeply involved in co-ops and the like, why aren't co-ops more prevalent within the Black community? And I'm speaking mainly from a Canadian context, but it was actually quite reflective as well in Oakland. And he simply answered, co-ops are a white thing. So I thought to myself, what are the different narratives and systems needed to be disrupted to ensure that there's access to have this reimagining occur of what ownership could look like? Unless an intersectional lens is added to the reclaiming of the commons, it is vulnerable in reinforcing systems of oppression, exclusion, and the exploitation of social capital. So how make these models or systems of reorganizing and disrupting capitalism? Sorry I'm reading, these were, as I mentioned, I've been marinating on this for like 5 years, and then over the last year it got really crazy. So how might these models or systems of reorganizing and disrupting capitalism be leveraged to support communities, people, or groups that have a deficit of social capital, or I would argue different kinds of social capital, as a means by which to empower and build the capacity of the communities? I would even take it a step further and inquire what it might mean when these communities begin to lead and initiate projects that seek to democratize the commons and ensure accessibility for all, not just financial access or capital, but again, mainly social capital. I believe this can and must be resolved by establishing not only financial principles to the model, but implementing governance frameworks that ensure integrity of equitable values persisting beyond a generation of occupancy. So the Hogan's Alley Working Group proposed principles with regards to the Northeast Falls Creek development around access and inclusion, security of land tenure, community investment, and recognition and honoring to ensure that any development on the land where Hogan's Alley is or was, that would reflect these values in perpetuity. Zoning, development, and financial models do very little, like in terms of the institutional aspect, to germinate widespread action in this space. What has been the difference with the Hogan's Alley project is the political will to engage in this capacity. Just even the fact that they're willing to entertain a conversation has been really interesting. What is even more interesting is that the proposal as it stands threatens the order of urban understanding. You know, just 100% rental community land ownership, despite the clear ethos of collective community land ownership, some capitalist values and rhetoric continues to rise of it's mine, it's yours, it's ours, when we need to stop and think about it as ours. And even when we say that on unceded territory, what does that actually mean? So today the removal of the viaducts presents an opportunity for ensuring there's adequate historical recognition on the site and to enable the commons to lead and steward the rebuilding of what was lost so many years ago. A movement towards community land stewardship ensures this development provides a long-term and self-determined security of land tenure and guards against the possibility of forced displacement, and mitigates against further contribution to the spatial inequality and segmentation that is growing in our city. We can all contribute to a vision that opens a space to generate meaningful and substantive opportunities for social and economic inclusion, driven and led by the community, grounded on aspirational value sets and community development principles.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Who wants to go next, man?
Sure, I got it.
Okay.
Wow, thanks. Thanks, man. Thanks a lot. So we got the first, was it the first chapter or the introduction?
Introduction,
It
yeah.
was the introduction of the book, so it was terrific, and thanks a lot for that. And thanks to my fellow panelists here, and thanks to you guys. Thanks to Nick for organizing it. And I would also just say too that our gratitude for being here on the unceded Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh traditional territory. So grateful to be here on that. I would say also, just as a little footnote to my comments, your phrase around participation just being work, it's brilliant, it's fantastic. That's my favorite part of the whole thing, it was so smart. So I'm going to ask, I got 3 questions for you, Amanda. 3 questions, and I'm going to ask them out here and then kind of direct them to your way. You can answer them as much or as little as you feel like, or whatever part. I'm going to kind of ask them to everybody, but it's kind of my cultural heritage is passive aggressiveness, so I'm kind of asking this way, you know. So the first one is, and I'm actually just going to echo Antonia here on this, is that I am actually, after a long time of spending much of my energy thinking through kind of commons and literature, I'm actually tremendously suspicious of the commons, and I'm even more suspicious of commons language. And I suspect that you were getting to that in a further chapter, but I didn't get there. So, but just to re-echo again, just briefly what Antonio started poking at, is that all too often languages around community and commons represent a particular kind of erasure of history. As my collaborator and colleague Glenn Coulthard likes to point out, that very oftentimes that new commons then somehow easily erase histories of indigenous dispossession and the layers and layers of dispossession, that as soon as you claim to be a commons, then it's all good, we're all cool now, right? Like it's a common, everybody is welcome, it's good. And then very oftentimes then those layerings and layerings of dispossessions that are somehow wiped clean. And you see this in the language around community, for example, which is why it's so easy to say the word a gated community. For example, the language is so malleable and so plastic in so many ways, and it gets, forgive me, but co-opted so easily. And I see the language of the commons as particularly apoliticized and depoliticized in that way. And so I'm wondering how you could, how you might deal with that. That in particular, but also the language of the commons suggests that as soon as you create a commons, then everybody has equal access or equal opportunity, which is of course not true. Like you even think in, for example, just in all the gendered ways that the common spaces are available to people differentially, and how that your use of the commons then. And I really admire your book and your work, and at the same time, I'd like you to speak to kind of that suspicion of the commons language and the kind of suggestion of depoliticization around it. So that's my first question.
Cool, yeah.
My second question is more of a functional question on this. And feel free to just ignore any of this. Is a threshold problem. there's something you say right at the very beginning there. You sort of said like, well, they got together and bought the place. And that sounds great, like that's like, I'm like, yo,
Yeah.
that's, yeah, like, go, yeah, absolutely. And you know, like, and I'm a huge fan, as I think you know a little bit anyways, of limited equity and community land trust schemes and shared equity schemes. And yet in contemporary and particularly globalized cities, just the damn money is so much, right? Like, even me, like a middle-aged, relatively middle-class white dude, I've sat and tried to run some numbers on what it would take for me and like a big bunch of my buddies to purchase a property. I've rented the same house for the last 25 years. And it's just nuts, frankly speaking. Even Hogan's Alley, like, and spending a lot of time looking at the numbers are like, even with very significant contributions, the numbers are still like just tough, right? They're just tough, and you're like, okay, neighbors get, like, if it's totally unthinkable for me to kind of like, oh, why don't we get together and buy the building? And like, I got some money, like, you know, like I don't have family money, but I have like an income, and it's not even, just what I'm saying, so I wonder about the threshold problem. That's something that John Davis, who's probably encountered, but it's really well about in terms of the threshold problem of that, is that for some of us, the numbers are like, just the sheer numbers are like scales beyond our normal thinking.
Yes.
So that's my second question. What do you, and I saw, like, I mean, I don't know how that woman raised $2.2 million in 1979, which is unbelievable, but what does that mean now? So that's my second question on that. And I guess my third question is, it's a somewhat personal question, I would guess, in some ways. And it's a question of like, around digging in or moving out. And it's a very personal question in a lot of ways, and I've been experiencing this a lot myself, and a whole bunch of my new research is I've been doing it in a number of places. And there's this really interesting phenomenon where in many neighborhoods around North America, but I've been, just recently I spent some time in Seattle doing this, is that really good quality and very organized institutions fighting gentrification, the ones that are the most successful, dig in and buy their building, for example, and then the neighborhood around them moves on.
Yeah.
So I spent a bunch of time at a place called El Centro de la Raza, which some of you I think in the room have been to with me. And they're this incredible organization in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Seattle. And they bought this old school and they've developed this incredible kind of infrastructure around their nonprofit. But it's like 90% of the people who use their services have to bus for more than 45 minutes because, well, they're successful. The gentrification has handled the neighborhood and everybody else has moved on. And so this is true, you see this over and over again with, like, so for example, in the neighborhood that I studied in Portland in that last book, it's a neighborhood where 10,000 black people have been moved out in the course of 20 years. And that there's a great effort now, a right to return effort, and some incredibly ambitious and audacious plans for people to return to the neighborhood. But one of my buddies there, he says, well, why would a black person move back here? Because it's not just residents, it's actually 95 black-owned businesses that are down to only 4 businesses. They're like, it's not a black neighborhood, why do you want to live here then? And this is true for so many of us. And so in my case, and I've rented for the last 25 years in just near Commercial Drive. And I was a long time, like, kind of like, I fought for that neighborhood. And it's like, without being, being a drama queen about it, like I lost. Like, we all lost. And I don't have any fidelity to that neighborhood anymore. And all my work now is in the suburbs. I'm a community organizer, and all my work is in Surrey because I have no fidelity anymore to my neighborhood where I grew up. And so I just wonder about that, about there's some kind of like, I'm frankly speaking. So those are 3 questions, or 3 sort of comments, and I want to know how to deal with this, because we just had our friend Kenny was just here, and exactly the same as the famous kind of examples in Boston, right? Where the neighborhoods bought their limited equity co-ops and built this beautiful thing, and the neighborhood went on, and now they're this kind of little island in a sea of displacement.
Yes. Yeah.
Those are my 3 questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Thank you.
Should I respond now, or should
No,
we
you
wait?
don't have to hold on. You're going to have to keep adding them up.
Okay.
I'm going to ask some questions.
Okay,
It's
all right.
really going to get fun.
Looking forward to it, all right.
It's going to be like soup. People like that. Mama,
Yes.
great. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And before I forget, I just wanted to say something about this community in Portland. I was talking to someone about philanthropists who apparently offered a bunch of money for people who've been displaced to come back. I don't know if you know anything about it, but I just wanted to flag that. I designed my talk in response to you based on the work that I'm doing in the community. When you mentioned those tenants who got together and were able to purchase the building, I was thinking about the situation here that in the downtown east side, this is the low-income community, so we're not talking about ability to buy a building because most people rely on social assistance and pensions. So the idea of buying a building is totally out of the question. And what tenants organizers do, they work with tenants to train them to be able to advocate for themselves. Because we find that storytelling is very powerful. When tenants are able to put together affidavits, talk about why they started a tent city and why it's critical for them to stay there, often those stories are very powerful that they are able to win cases. This is an example of a 10-year tent city where people just took over this empty lot, a lot that had actually been empty for more than 10 years, and they forced the city to respond. First, the city tried to evict them, saying this is trespassing and you have to go. They refused and they fought in court. And they won based on the affidavits, and also because the city was not able to prove that there was harm and that they had a place to take these people to. People claim that shelters are not homes because if you're a couple, if you have a pet, you definitely can't go into those shelters. And so the key for these organizers is to remind the state that housing is a human right. It's not just a commodity that you can use to make profit over people, but that they should build homes that are affordable, that are dignified, where people can live. So the strategy then is to train people to advocate and empower people to find a political voice. And when they do, it's amazing how this really strengthens them and transforms the process. So looking at tenants' resistance and how they fight back and how they claim public lands to use, ideas have come up that taking over a building and forcing the government to build. So I'm just putting this question out there. Maybe you've come across similar cases or the audience. Just this idea that the government has to respond, and we'll try to force the government to do it by any means necessary, whether we take over a building and we're arrested and the media talks about it, maybe it will lead to change. And the other examples of thinking, the question about how the commons be thought in a more active sense as commoning. It made me think of a case of South Central LA gardener, someone called Ron Finley, who is also known as a gangster gardener. He compared his South Central LA neighborhood to places like Beverly Hills, and he realizes that in Beverly Hills, there's a lot of green areas, and they have healthy foods, whereas in South Central LA, you have liquor stores, fast foods, and empty lots. And so he wanted to beautify his community by building forest gardens, where he would take sidewalks and put in vegetable gardens, and the city came after him, and he decided to fight it in court. And what he said was, this is owned by the people, but the city has jurisdiction over this. So for the city to actually fight him was tough, because here's a man who was turning an ugly spot into a beautiful area, with creating opportunity for people to have healthy organic foods, and he won. He won because the city said, the court said that there's no, he said, yeah, the court ruled that no permit is required to plant gardens in LA parkways, which is really amazing that all of a sudden people began to come out and work with this initiative to transform these abandoned lands into beautified, edible gardens where there's fruit and vegetables, and it's actually free. So this is, I thought, was an interesting example of urban commons, where people come, even though they know each other, but they come and they have a shared goal, and they can develop a community relationship and responsibility. So,
Thank you very much. So I know you have lots of things to think about, but I'm just going to throw it open to the floor, because maybe, I'm sure there are some comments or questions that we can throw into the mix, and then see what you want to do. We can become an intellectual commons. So please.
I just have what I think is a fairly straightforward question for Amanda, but maybe it's not. Just when you're talking about, I'm curious about the extent of when this movement was in sort of full flower. So exactly how extensive was it? Like, is there a number of how many buildings you have, or the percentage of housing stock? Either entirely or through these different programs like the TOPA thing or whatever that you mentioned. Just curious, like how far inextensive, and how far inextensive did it get when it was sort of at its peak, and then how much is that sort of retreated or retracted at this point?
Jean has a question for Rebecca.
Oh, I just thought it would be good if you could answer Matt's questions.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Seconded, yes.
Right?
I'm also waiting for the answers to
Oh.
those 3 questions, but just one little one.
Yeah.
You had pictures of Mayor Barry and some of the others there. And I'm just wondering what role, government plays. Here in Canada, we have a double problem. Cities here are wards of the provinces, so you need not only a progressive city government, but you need a progressive provincial government. So I lived in Toronto when we had a very progressive reform council in the 70s and into the 80s. And a lot was accomplished, including a lot of co-ops and social housing then, until the provincial government changed, and then later so did the city government. And so that's a real challenge. In Vancouver, we have, it doesn't matter what government's in, whatever their stated ideology, they are very close friends to the big developers. And, so it's really an uphill battle. So, I mean, is it absolutely a necessary condition to have a sympathetic and powerful enough to act on a city government? Or are there things that you can do, especially with regards to your co-ops, in the face of not friendly governance?
Yes.
Any more for now? Yes.
So you probably already answered this just since it's related to what the panelists were also asking. But when people are trying to buy back their housing or buy housing, are there some groups that or demographics that would be more successful than others? Like if it is mostly pensioners, for example, may have a harder time if they were a larger amount within it, or whether they would have to be other demographics that would have a likelier chance or opportunity.
Thanks. Okay, John.
I don't know how much work has been done with unions as well, as far as union pension plans. Those are sometimes, I know, hard to, because unions don't often have control over their pension funds, but some unions have, and I wonder if you know of any projects. I know here in a couple of co-ops, the unions, the building trades at one time, there were a more progressive union at the time, were involved in building that co-op. And I guess the second thing, so the union involvement, there are also people here that have far more knowledge around the Hogan's Alley revitalization, or what we want to call it, renewal, or I like to call it reconciliation, or something broader even. And I think of the north side of Falls Creek, especially the last parcel, where they're now talking about planning it for many more condominiums. That was once public land that was actually pretty much given away. I mean, it was stolen first. We all have to remember that, which was your point, was First Nations land. But the provincial government owned it and gave it away for a song, and developers have made nothing but money off the subdivision. And given Hogan's Alley, given the theft of First Nations land, and given the treatment of the Chinese community, that's sort of like the I call it a four-way crossing there, right? Many things have happened there. Has there been any idea, or for further discussion of really pushing in a public way? And I think in terms of those guerrilla gardens as well, and things that people can do to highlight that land that's actually common land, using that term loosely, that can actually be a place of reconciliation for all the groups that have their land stolen. People actually with Hogan's Alley gentrified out, and people who have lost their rights in the Chinese community and lost land in the Japanese, etc. And that could be really a focus for organizing around something in that area in a big way. I know people have been working on it, so I don't know what the work's been done so far, but it's maybe part of a bigger discussion. I don't know how much we can have here.
Okay, so maybe respond?
Oh my God. There's some very specific questions I feel like could answer relatively quickly, but I'd rather start with the big ones.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of is the commons really the right way to think about this stuff? I mean, given, and sort of this question about this sort of suspicion of the commons and the idea that it's, I mean, I think, it's funny, I mean, that the commons or that language has been used in ways, and of course, commons, I mean, my God, shopping malls call themselves commons. I mean, there's just that word is just so loosely applied, and it's really, it's almost, it's really just a sort of very, I don't know, on a certain level, it's a very non-descriptive word. It's just totally generic, kind of, But I think the reason that I gravitated towards the idea of the commons when thinking about these housing co-ops was really sort of because of my understanding of commons as kind of these spaces or resources that are decommodified and are collectively governed. And so kind of those two things going together seems like, at least to my understanding, historically is sort of an important Like that's how the commons has been defined historically. But there's so many different ways that that idea is used, absolutely. And I think, I mean, so I'm talking in the book about the commons broadly, but I'm really looking specifically at these co-ops. And I think, you know, one thing that's really has been missing for a long time until Jessica Gordon-Emhart wrote her book, Collective Courage, which is about the history of black cooperatives in the United States, which is like a very important book that kind of corrects this myth that co-ops are like a white thing, and have always been a white thing. And in fact, she documents really well how co-ops have been started by African Americans throughout U.S. history, really because of exclusion from the market and not having access to the capital and the social capital, the financial capital, all that. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think co-ops generally, when people hear about co-ops, it's like a white kind of privileged thing, and that is true in many cases for sure. And so is it? And so then, with thinking about the commons, I mean, and I talk a little bit later in the book about this. You know, I guess I am interested in this idea of the commons and saying, well, what more can we do with it? And could, and I'm not in the book developing a theory of like race in the commons or blackness in the commons, but it does seem like that would be an incredibly cool thing, an important thing to do at some point for someone to do. Because I do think, especially when I think about like the community land trust movement in the US, and ultimately in the book I'm like, that's what's more interesting to me. In the end, is community land trust is a possibility because it, like we were talking about, you have much more control of land at a kind of a larger scale. There's more support for people, and I'm totally intrigued by this thing of community land trusts just having rental property on them, and like using that to challenge ideas about property and ownership, and also just to maintain that housing in an affordable way. But community land trusts in the U.S. really sprang out of the civil rights movement, at least our modern community land trusts. And so when and came out of the attempt to preserve black land in the South. Right, yeah, farmland. Yeah, exactly. And so when I think about that, and people, well, one of the women who I talked to who was like she lived in a couple co-ops, but she also was a big housing organizer and helped a lot of them get started. And so she was had a real, you know, she had a real politics about the whole thing. You know, she talked a lot about that, about how, you know, this was a civil rights, this came out of the civil rights movement, these land trusts and these co-ops. She very much saw herself as a black woman in DC. This was sort of an extension of her civil rights work that she'd been doing, was helping create these co-ops. And so, I mean, she didn't use I don't think she used the word commons to describe what she was doing, though. I mean, that was not language that she was using. That is language that another organizer I spoke with did and does use, but yeah, I mean, in the end, I want to see land decommodified and under community control. And so in the end, I'm like, the commons, if people don't think the commons is a useful way of talking about it, then like, that's fine with me. You know, I'm just like, it's a term I have found useful, but maybe it's not. You know, and maybe it does like sort of gloss over things that we need to pay attention to. And DC is sort of an unusual case in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think that's a really important question. Like, is this the best terminology to use? I know, like, one of my advisors when I was working on my dissertation, I was saying I want to think about the urban commons. He was like, why don't you just use the right to the city framework? You know, talk about people's right to be in place. And I was like, I don't know, that just seems like, and I know you write about this in your book, Matt, too. It's like, the rights language didn't seem to me to quite capture what I saw happening, really. You know, it was, people were not claiming rights, they were doing work, and they were working together to like, they had to, and rights sort of sounds, I don't know, commoning, I think it implies, at least the way I understand it, that you're like, you have to actually do some
Like
stuff
self-determination.
together. Yeah, exactly, self-determination, and that one of these groups that was doing a lot of this work was called Washington Inner City Self-Help, like it was this very, and self-help not in the like neoliberal kind of way that's become to be understood, but really like people getting together to help themselves, self-determination, absolutely, yeah. And so, but yeah, but again, I think it can be a useful term, but I'm willing to like move on to something else for sure, for sure, definitely. No, yeah. So and then let's see. also, okay, the question about like digging in or moving out is like, I think about that all the time, and I'm like, I'm so sick of the city. I'm so sick of it, you know, like, get me out of here, you know? And I'm just like, oh, the urban content, who cares, you know? Like, let's just like move on to where like, you know, people are, where, you know, I don't know. But I do, yeah, and I think, I mean, I see this happening. I mean, I live a couple blocks from where I grew up. The neighborhood I live in is totally unaffordable. It's been totally gentrified. It's a totally different place. When I grew up, and the same thing. I'm like, I don't actually even feel any attachment to it anymore. I mean, it's taken me a long time to like get over my attachment to that place because it was a very different place in the 70s and 80s. But it's just like, it's not, you know, it's just filled with billion-dollar homes now, and the people who can afford to buy those homes. So, I mean, I can still walk by my old house, but so what, you know? It's, and I do think that that points to some really interesting questions about like movement of people and like, you know, at some point, you know, like, so now it's, I mean, it's true here, it's true many places, like the suburbs are where lower income people are moving. And so like, but then do we dig in there? You know, I mean, or, I mean, is that ultimately like, that's gonna get gentrified too? You know, you think about like, so I don't know, and it raises some really interesting questions about just like the, I don't know, like the movement and sort of, and place attachment too, and like communities, you know, what do we, how do you form community? I mean, it's just, yeah, do you just say, do you just give up on trying to defend or, you know, stay with this one community and then just start over somewhere else? I think it's a really important question. I don't know the answer. I mean, certainly in DC, a lot of community organizations in neighborhoods that are now gentrified have now opened up branches in the suburbs, you know, because that's where their work is more, it's where their people are going. And that totally makes sense. And I think, yeah, I vacillate on that. I mean, as a sort of personal reflection on the degree to which it's worth kind of staying and fighting for a certain place once it's emptied of the people who kind of made it that place. And to what extent you should say, just let's move on somewhere else. And that also ties into the financial questions too, actually, because like you would think about how do you actually pay to do this? And in the city, I mean, the $2.2 million came from city loans, it came from private banks, it came from cobbling together this whole mess of finances. It came from tenants raising the money themselves too, but not that much. I mean, they're low income. Many, in that particular building, you know, people who are undocumented, like it's just like very difficult to raise money. But the city had a bunch of different programs to sort of cobble together with private financing to make it happen. But that, of course, is increasingly hard today. And co-ops are still formed in DC and tenants still purchase their buildings, but at a very much slower rate. And so I think that goes to your question too about like, you know, there are fewer today than there were in, you know, the sort of heyday of this movement in the 80s, sort of the first half of the 80s probably, yeah. And some co-ops have, you know, a lot of different, you know, not all of them continue to exist as limited equity co-ops today. Some have converted, not many actually, but some have converted to market rate condominium status. And that's an interesting story. Some of them have what we might say quote unquote failed, but I don't necessarily see it as failure. Like they were not able to keep up financially. And some of them have been taken over by nonprofit housing providers who now they're now rentals again instead of being owned, but they're owned by an affordable housing organization that's committed to keeping rents low. So that's a good thing. I mean, and that also, you know, I mean, I think these are an interesting form of homeownership. I think they've been really important ideologically in the city because they are mostly African American and immigrant. I mean, not entirely certainly, but mostly, and sort of ideologically important. Ideologically is like saying, you know, we too have a stake in the city, and we have like this ownership, but then that gets back to the question of like thinking about ownership, like you were talking about, you know, this sort of individualizing idea of owning something and being mine. Like the individualization of it, yeah.
And there was the question about governments.
Oh, yeah.
Unions too.
Right, no, totally. Okay, unions, zero anything going on with unions in the co-ops. As far as I've known, maybe there's something I don't know about, which is entirely possible, but I've never heard of that happening. And then, yeah, in terms of the government, I mean, we're also in a weird position because we're not part of the state, so all of our budgets and laws have to be approved by Congress, which at times is quite you know, antagonistic to and it's actually sort of amazing that we've been able, that Congress has, I mean, Congress really was opposed to this TOBA law when it was first, because it had to pass congressional approval. So there's interesting, like, you know, you can look at the testimony, the hearings on this stuff. But they did not, in the end, oppose it or stop it. And so yeah, we've had a lot of like real right-wing congressional oversight over the city. But no, totally. I think if your systems are in place and they're strong, then hopefully, you know, you've just got a law in place and you've got the law. I think there's greater likelihood that the financing will be taken away than the law be changed necessarily. But the law without the financing is totally pointless, you know, because the whole point is the money's not there. Now, I should say though that this Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act in DC, many tenants have exercised that right and not used the right to buy, actually, but have used it to exact concessions from their landlords. So saying, we will give up our right to buy if you pay us all money to just go away and give up our rights. And so that's actually, so the law has actually been used a lot in that way too. And in fact, when the council first passed it, there was debates in the council between, is this a law to preserve affordable housing in the city to allow low-income tenants to stay in place? Or is this a law to just give people bargaining power because they don't have capital, their landlords do? And in fact, so from the very beginning, a lot of tenants have exercised this right to just extract dividends from their landlords, and still do today. So a lot of tenants will say, well, we might exercise our right to purchase. We might really slow down your sale. We know you want to sell like now, but if we exercise our right to sort of pursue a sale, then you get a certain amount of time built into the law. So you get up to like a year and a half to kind of make it work. But that's so you could say, and the landlords are like, I want to sell it right now. I don't want to wait a year and a half, you know. And so you could kind of negotiate. Yeah. But I do think it really comes down to, it connects to the funding question. We have a 1.1% dedicated real estate deed and recordation tax. So anytime any property is bought or sold, you pay 1.1% of the sale price into a city fund that it creates an affordable housing trust fund. And so that's like a dedicated stream. And the cool thing about it is that that's...
You could do that?
It's a tax, I guess, this path. The cool thing about it is the more sales there are, like the more activity there is in the market, and the higher the prices are, the more money goes into this fund. And so we've actually been pretty good at getting that tax established, and then also making sure that money isn't siphoned off into non-housing projects, but kept in that fund. But so there's all sorts of creative things one could think of if one could get them passed into law and then enforced. I feel like I'm missing some questions here.
There's so much to say, but
Yeah.
do you guys want to respond or address this question that John was raising about Open Valley? Yeah.
Do you want to? We can go up and bounce off each other. But early last year, it was proposed to, a letter of intention was provided to the city to make that land that Hogan's Alley is on a community land trust. So those that would live on the block, those that are adjacent, it would be held in community land stewardship, knowing that that's a piece of city land relative to the rest of the whole project. So there was that desire, not just from kind of the Northeast Falls Creek Stewardship Group, but just in terms of being able to maintain that the intergenerational aspect of the land there, that was proposed. So in the final Northeast Falls Creek plan, there's a full chapter called Reconciliation and Cultural Redress, which speaks to Hogan's Alley and does speak to the city's commitment to continue to connect with the Black community in exploring the possibility of land trusts. And so that's something that we're working on. Do you want to maybe add any?
Yeah, totally. I think the whole idea was that people who were displaced and in bringing them back, we wanted to create a fund that would create housing, business opportunity that you can't sell out. So the good thing about community land trust is that it prevents it from going into speculation. So only those people who benefit are people who are part of the community land trust. And so it's it's a sustainable way to build wealth and share it among the people. Yeah.
Can I ask one small question?
Yeah.
I'm gonna be tremendously inarticulate about this, so I apologize in advance. So, like, there's documented in places, like every place, this constant documented history of displacement, of dispossession, of gentrification, of land theft, layered upon layered, right? Like here, like even just in like the small area we're talking about, like Japanese dispossession on top of Chinese dispossession, on top of black dispossession, on top of all the stolen indigenous land, that poor people being doing. It just seems one after the other. And then I see these unbelievable, like this long kind of continuous history of totally heroic efforts.
Yeah.
Like unbelievably, like, and I think about this Hogan Valley thing, who I've been, supporting from afar when I can in various ways and with my friends. Like it's like the sophistication behind it is unbelievable. Like the financial sophistication, the organizational sophistication, the sheer amount of energy, and I think now, so I've been turning over this idea of participation of work. You think about these co-ops, this massive amount of effort that goes in, the sheer amount of sweat equity, of intellectual labor, of personal labor, just to be able to reoccupy the place. And I don't know, and I'm not going to attribute this to you, Lama, but I think you're kind of poking at it a little bit. And I think I kind of heard a tiny bit from you too. It was like, these fuckers took it.
Yeah, I know.
And then people have to go through this unbelievable effort, like this unbelievably sophisticated effort through generations and decades of like just watching my friends put hundreds of hours of sophisticated labor in just to be able to reoccupy land that was fucking stolen in the first place, over and over again. And it seems to me that, why should people not just take it back? Like, I'm being really inarticulate on this, but I'm putting my way in a kind of, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
Like, why do these people have to spend all this energy? So I often quote my friend Leanne Simpson, who says, she has this phrase, some of you have probably heard this from me before, I apologize on that, but she says, that even under Canadian law, when you steal something and you get caught, you have to give it back. If I steal a car, and I keep it for 10 years, and I really like it, and it's a really nice car, and my family really needs it, and I really need it, and it's been in my family for a long time, but I get caught, I still have to give it back. And through whole separate means, and you think about the United States, from slavery through redlining, through all kinds of nefarious means, both legal and extra-legal and otherwise, that have dispossessed, racialized and poor people, and continue to do so over and over again. And then it's our responsibility to come up with these unbelievably time-heavy and sophisticated methods for just clawing back a little piece. Fuck that. Why shouldn't we just take it back? And I don't know how to do it exactly.
I look like
If I knew exactly. I think you were kind of pushing in that direction, right? It's like, I don't like the language of rights. Because rights sounds like, to me, rights means it means I'll beat you in court.
Locked in the institutional aspect.
Totally.
And so I don't know where I'm going, but I feel like you were kind of pushing there, Lama.
And I think that the advances that we've made have a lot to do with the fact, number one, that request was granted justice. But also, I think the thing that really moved the needle was the observation by the UN experts of African descent, how they wrote a report, a scathing report, showing how Canada has undermined and treated black people in a horrible way. So as soon as that report was released, Nova Scotia said, oh, black people, oh, sorry, we gave you land, but we never gave you the title. Here it is. They released $2.7 million to do that. And in Vancouver, I guess they got the message and said, if we do this, we might look pretty good. So it takes an outsider, a powerful outsider like the UN, to shine the light and all of a sudden things over. I don't know what would have happened if that report wasn't released, but I think it takes shaming, it takes something dramatic for change to occur. Otherwise, why would they do it?
Please.
Yeah, I guess maybe just to make a counterpoint, although I do agree with your underlying point, Matt, about, you know, something that is stolen remains stolen no matter how long it's been stolen. That's still the truth. But I guess it's maybe not a counterpoint, but just there's been a lot of discussion about or reference, and it happens in Vancouver a lot too, about we must decommodify housing. And so I guess just my counterpoint to that point, to that idea, is, and it's not that I don't want that, I do want that, but I guess I just think that maybe we should be cautious about that, because I don't think that can actually land, this is like super depressing, but can we actually ever decommodify land, like short of ending capitalism, right? Because you just talked about how you put some land into the commons and then it got taken out again. And just like you probably can't have socialism in one country, you can't have it in one building either for very long, right? You know? So, like we can't be outside nature, we can't be outside our society, and if we think we are, that's probably really a reflection of our privilege. And so I would say the same thing about land. And again, it's not that I want it to be this way, but it's just we are in a society that has the pressures and structure that it does for now. I'm not saying that's a permanent state of affairs, but.
Sorry, that's good.
Yeah.
You can go ahead.
No.
Joe, I like that expression, and it's very dramatic. Why don't we just take it back? And then the response was, what does that look like? On the big scale, I'm not sure. Like, how do we take back the world? But an example locally comes to mind. I don't necessarily like the total outcome, but it was the Woodwards building. The Woodwards building started, it was boarded up for a number of years, and originally it wasn't owned by anybody. It was just sold, and I don't know who was holding the property. It might have been the province. And it was a usual BC government at the time that sold it to a developer, and it was going to be all condominiums. So what does it look like when you say, I'm sorry, you may think you own this, but it has belonged to the city, and it has belonged to the, using that loosely, community word, for ages, and we're taking it back. And what that looked like is it started off with people going down with buckets and brooms and sweeping and cleaning it up and painting murals on it. And then that built into people from all parts of the city coming and putting their arms around the building all the way around. And then it was occupied. And they took it back in some way, and the shaming was really interesting because it shamed the developer so much, and he didn't want to deal with it anymore. He sold it to the province. Now, that's what it can look like, but it does take those ideas of breaking the so-called law and saying this has belonged to us for a lot longer than it's belonged to the single development. And it does take an incredible amount of work, but that's what it looks like. And I think of that northeast, that whole last part of northeast Falls Creek. And my response is that how in the world can we take that back from a developer who's made nothing but money off of that by somehow occupying that land with gardens or whatever the case is? I'm not saying it's going to happen, but that's what it looks like on a bigger scale. I don't know if it's possible to move Trudeau or embarrass Trudeau enough where federal funds can be released, because in Canada that's what you got to do. And that idea, 3 levels of government. City has land usually, but doesn't have extra money to build. Provinces have been sometimes right-wing, while the civic government has been more left, and we've never had all 3 together. But that to me is one of the things that we have to start doing, I think. I don't know what that looks like. I only know what the Woodwards building looks like. I wish it would have had a better result. There were other ideas of what the development could have looked like, and it wouldn't have been such a large gentrifying force, I think, if it was done differently. But certainly that was a community movement. The idea of commons, layers and layers on it, but when I think of the commons, I go back to, I think of enclosures, the enclosures of the commons. And that's why commons to me is a brilliant idea, because it's saying we don't want to be enclosed, we don't want to be dominated, we don't want people continuing to take land. It's got to stop, and we have to do those things in common, I guess. But I'd like to see what the bigger part looks like.
There's only just one little thing I just want to say, just to throw it in there. So I'm jumping ahead. It's like, and I started it, but when we say like, we take it back, it's a particularly problematic thing for a white dude like me.
Well, of course it is.
But actually, who's the we, who's the us?
But we got to start somewhere.
And actually on indigenous land, that's actually very, it's not the we.
Of course it is. I mean, but the thing is that would be a common part of it. We would go to elders and say, you know, we want to work with you to do the best thing we can think of doing with the land, given where we're at. Otherwise, I think, then I can give up saying things. I'm not saying that I have a right to say something, because I realize that I'm a white man. But at the same time, I want to be able to say, I want to work with other people who are not white men to come up with a solution about stopping what's going on now. And I'm quite willing to figure out how to do that without being sort of like, I can't say anything.
No, go
No,
ahead.
no, no, you go ahead.
I was just saying really quickly, and I really appreciate what you were saying about storytelling and the importance of storytelling, because I do think there's all these histories and stories that we don't always pass on or know or remember. And like in the end of the book, I start the conclusion of the book talking about a different form of commons, because it's all focused on housing in the book. But I want to emphasize there's like lots of kinds of commons. But a story similar maybe to the Woodward story, a little bit different, but there was a vacant tract of land in DC, a 4-acre tract of land, so a pretty big tract of land, that was owned by a speculator who's waiting for it to appreciate. This was in the 60s. And it was in a neighborhood that was very densely packed, had lots of people living there, lots of young people living there, working class neighborhood, very integrated racially and ethnically. But there was a youth group led by a man named Walter Pierce, who was an African-American organizer there, who had this youth group. And he was really, needed space for these kids. And so he worked with a bunch of neighbors to start something on this vacant plot of land that this guy owned. And so they worked out a deal with the guy where they could rent it for $1 a year. The guy's like, fine, you can do what you want. I mean, I still own it, and one day one day when my investment matures, I'll sell it. But so they spent 11 years like building playground equipment, deciding how to use the space together, having all these youth programs there, and doing some amazing stuff on this tract of land. And so then in the late 70s, when land was really going up in value, the owner said, okay, I'm ready to sell. And his plan was, he said, I'm going to sell it to this developer who's going to build 156 luxury townhomes on this land. And the people who were using that space said no. And they fought back, and they fought back. And I need to do more research into this story, because I know the basic outlines of it, but I don't know exactly how they did everything. But ultimately, the city used its power of eminent domain to force the owner of the land to sell it to the city, not to them, but to the city. Yeah. And so it is today, it's just a city park. It's called Walter Pierce Park. It's named for that community organizer. It's just a regular old city park in this neighborhood. No, you would never know the incredible sort of work and creative organizing that went into reclaiming that. And people just took it back, They took it back from a speculator who was sitting on it. And they got it, they won. But it's a very small scale. It's 1 4-acre piece of land. And I totally agree. And when you look at the archives of the papers from these co-ops, it's insane the amount of work that's documented in these papers. Like the letters people are writing and the forms they're filling out, and just, my God, it's insane. Yeah, and I think the question is, how do we just take it back? I'm excited to think more about that. So
I'm going to say just 2 things. I was going to respond to that, but I also wanted to just kind of jump back past before this kind of conversation, just to your comment about there's some problematic use of the commons, or maybe can we get rid of it and all that. But I would say, because as someone who has just been deeply obsessed with the commons and the language around it,
Yeah.
just that I think that what your book has done is actually opened it up. And when we talk about that being critical or at least interrogating what the commons is and that suspicion of the commons, the book opens it up to that, because as it is now, we still have that romantic idea of this is what the commons are, and so if we implement a commons, it's all good, everyone's happy, and you know, kumbaya, whatever it may be. But so I just want to say, like, the fact that you've opened it up to critique is extremely necessary. So I wouldn't have abandoned it by any means, because I think we really need to start digging into those words that we use and understand what it could mean. And then just on your point about, you know, can we, just short of getting rid of capitalism, like how does I think it comes to like kind of that sustained piece. And I'm gonna get a little esoteric and like romantic, unfortunately, about it, is that, you know, when it comes to these different commons or collective movements, around the efficacy of the vision to be able to be carried, you know, intergenerationally, and it being a kind of a visceral part of the people that are involved, and it inspires other people. So through the work of the Hogan's Alley work, you know, while we're still literally in the midst of that grind, what we hope is that there's an inspiration for other people to also see how things can be done, or learn from us, or even if we make mistakes, that they can come up with an evolution of it. But I think it takes these either little or just persistent, perseverant movements to be able to see how to make it, to possibly see that shift. So if we want to see capitalism end to a certain extent, we need to just kind of start taking the steps towards it. But then kind of what I was alluding to too is like, we can't deny, you know, our white patriarchal capitalist society and the values that have been entrenched over generations. So you can still operate in the commons, but still have that value, the value system of like, this is my commons. And so how do you work through that?
I think we're kind of just about out of time here, unfortunately. But you know, please, you know, we can chat here, and I found this really immensely stimulating. And just as a thread, I mean, one of the things that comes to my mind is this notion of commoning. I think what's useful about it is that it takes us away from the spaces, away from the commons. Those are important. I mean, they can be important. So it's, you know, the Hogan's Alley project is important, as are these co-ops. They are important. They create material spaces that are important. But if we think about commoning as the work that goes on in relation to these projects and all the other work, like in this room right now, right? This is, you know, we are commoning, right? I mean, we are, you know, collectively sharing ideas and bouncing those ideas around and hopefully doing something that's, you know, non-speculative and productive, as I think it has been. So I think that's a very useful thread to pursue and to think through. So I want to thank you, Amanda, very much for coming here and sharing your work with us. And I want to thank the panelists for all their just really great interventions and questions, which we've begun to touch, have begun to unravel. There's so much more to be said. So please join me.
Oh my God.